Thanks for tuning in to today's podcast. Please remember that all of the information in this podcast episode is limited to general information only. That means the information is not specific to you, your needs, goals, or objectives, so you should seek the advice of a licensed and trusted financial professional before acting on the information. And before you acquire or apply for a financial product, please read the PDS or product disclosure statement, which should be available on the issuer's website. Lastly, please keep in mind that past performance is not indicative of future performance.
Hi Lacey, thank you so much for joining us on the Australian Finance Podcast today.
Thanks so much for having me, Kate. Looking forward to it.
Now, you're just stuck with me today. There's no Owen here because he's had a bit of a run with the microphone recently. So hopefully I can do us both justice.
I'm sure you will. I'm looking forward to it.
Wonderful. Well, I wanted to get you on the podcast because you've talked a lot recently about the concept of financial independence through your book, Money School, and your business as well, and a really awesome conference you've got coming up in the next week or so. So I was so excited to get you on so we could actually talk a bit about your own financial independence journey and a little bit about how could someone work out if the goal of financial independence and potentially retiring early is for them.
Yeah, well, they're great topics and obviously I love talking about them. So yeah, very excited to be chatting through those.
Awesome. So I thought we could kick it off with a little bit of a background on your own personal journey to financial independence, how you discovered the concept of financial independence and some of the things that motivated you to pursue that goal.
Well, I think a lot of people probably listening to this podcast have heard the term FIRE before, the financial independence, retiring early. And I actually didn't hear that term until I got to it, which was pretty funny. So I think the concept of financial independence needs to be separated out somewhat from the retiring early to talk about, because I think financial independence really reiterates for a lot of people what they've probably heard from mum and dad and from their grandparents over those years. And it's that idea of putting your money to work for you, so that you build up enough assets that they can pay you, and then work becomes optional. And of course, in the olden days, it used to be that you worked for a company and they paid you a pension. That's what you got for your lifetime of servitude. These days, people are having to take a lot more control over it because that's not so common anymore. And I guess that's what I sort of got to witness with happening with my mother. And that's how I started learning about investing and the importance of money, and then eventually getting to financial independence. Her dad had the typical worked for a company for 40 or 50 years, got a sweet pension, and life was grand. And of course, my mum was a single parent raising two girls, and my parents split when I was 8. And so I started hearing a lot more about money and the decisions she was making. And it was that phase of work not being so much about staying in the same company for decades anymore and building up those pensions. And so she started getting interested in investing and learning about it. She didn't have any money to do anything with at that time. This was when I was sort of in late primary school. But she was really keen to learn about it. And because she'd been working as a bookkeeper and then an accountant, she'd been seeing what other people had been doing with their money and had been talking to me about that sort of stuff. Yeah, lucky me. And I hadn't realized, I honestly didn't realize until I was in, my 20s, that not everybody's parent did that for them. I hadn't really thought about the fact that my mum was, she was frequently telling me little stories and snippets and planting little seeds. None of the big lectures. There wasn't like a sit down, Lacey, we're going to learn all about in shares today and get out your notebook for the next 3 hours or anything like that. It was just little snippets and regular and common to talk about. And she'd talk about that sort of stuff in the context as well of making decisions with the money that she had. What were we going to do on holiday? What kind of car would we buy? What could we afford for a mortgage? That kind of stuff. And I just had that happening and didn't really think about the fact that not everybody's parent talks about that stuff. There's quite a taboo on it for some families. Yeah. And not every parent knows as well, because if your parents didn't teach you about it, then how would they know? And it wasn't really strong in education schools. It's still a bit sort of sporadic. I would say we're getting much better, but our financial literacy stuff still doesn't look great. Bit of work to do there. So I guess if you don't hear about from mum and dad, how do you ever learn? So I'm one of those lucky people that had mum and dad telling me about it. Dad was more from the perspective of what not to do, poor man. But it was really good having the two examples in front of me of my mum of being careful with what she spent, learning to invest, and when she finally did have some money, which by the way was her late 40s, starting to do investing and talking me through the process. And then my dad, who he loves spending money. He would buy beautiful cars and beautiful clothes, and he ended up going bankrupt. So pretty interesting examples to have side by side. But yeah, so I guess that's what sort of happened. I got little bits of it, and then it got me excited. And then when I was 10, I started my first business. And I guess I was doing that as part of a school fete thing originally, but it ended up growing, and I ended up with 5 of my friends as my employees, which was pretty funny. Yeah. So yeah, I've always been quite bossy. Leadership skills, I'm supposed to say now, not bossy, of course, but never mind. You know what I mean?
Assertiveness.
Exactly. And my mum asked me when we were on our way to our first market, what was I going to do with the money that we made? And I was talking about, I suppose I could spend it. And then she explained compounding to me, explaining it like money breeding. Your money makes more money, and then it just keeps going. And I was amazed. And remember back then, that was like the early 90s, which will give you a bit of an idea of my age. Interest rates were astonishingly high. Like mortgages in the late 80s were 15% plus. It'd be like buying a house on a credit card, right? So, the interest we're talking about is much higher than it was compared to today's rates. And of course, so a few calculations with that, and I was blown away. That was it. I was hooked. And so, yeah, from 10 really it started. And then I just got interested in earning as much as I could through high school. And then when I got to university, got interested more in investing myself and started investing when I was 19. And so I just kept going with that. I bought property to start with, bought a few properties, and then got into shares. And then one day when I was finishing up work, because I was having my first child, we were working out whether I needed to go back to work. And I went, look at that. I've got enough money to cover our living costs from my shares and my properties. Wow, that's pretty cool. I don't think I had deliberately tried to get to a certain amount. It just happened to be that I was sort of thinking about what I was going to do. And it's not that I didn't have a plan to be financially independent. I definitely wanted to have enough assets. I just hadn't thought about the implication of work options and hadn't expected to get there quite so young. So very fortunate position to be in. Lots of good timing about that. But thanks, Mum and Dad, for teaching me about money.
Yeah, so there wasn't really, you didn't set off at 20 to become financially independent. You just wanted to start investing and compounding your money, and you sort of realised at one point that you were financially independent.
Exactly, which sounds like this happy accident, doesn't it? But it wasn't quite like that. It was more that I was earning a good wage as an engineer. And look, I've always saved half of every dollar that I've ever earned since I first had that business and earning pocket money and stuff. So that's been a thing that I have done my whole life. So the concept of waste was something that really connected to me. I thought if I was saving all this money, I should be doing something with it, or I should be, producing something with it, or putting it to work for me. And I'm cheap to run, so I didn't see any point in trying to spend more as my income increased. I just didn't want more things. I still had lots of fun. I like traveling and I like good food and wine, but just things like cars and clothes don't really interest me at all. So I'm quite lucky in that respect that I haven't had high ongoing living costs to indulge in luxuries. But it was more that idea of not wasting. I thought I would try and get to that point where I had enough assets to cover my income at some point. I just didn't quite expect to get there so early. And a lot of that's to do with lucky timing. I'm very lucky that I graduated into a mining boom with a set of skills that were in high demand. And also, got in at a time when the market looked terrible for property. Everybody was really depressed, not dissimilar to what you would expect to find right now with such low interest rates. Doesn't seem to have actually eventuated. But just glad that I had the guts to do it. It's a bit of timing luck there. But yeah, then all of a sudden, did the calculation. Wow, look at that. I don't have to work if I don't want to. We can afford to cover our food and our rent, and we're all okay. So that was a very pleasant surprise. And then a couple of years later, I started learning about, there was an actual movement about this, FIRE. And although I'd had the experiences of mini retirements, the retiring early bit didn't really do it for me because it's quite boring after a few months. You'll have to take my word for it.
Yeah, I find that most people retire early is just sort of code for do what I want with my time.
Exactly. It is exactly right. You hear, and I think a lot of people will hear retire early and go, oh, I'm never going to retire early. So they decide it's not for them, which is why I really like the idea of separating the concept of financial independence from whatever you do once you become financially independent, whether that is retire early or whether you work harder or run a startup or volunteer or look after your family, whatever you do. Separating the concept of the financial independence from what you do with your time afterwards, I think helps more people connect to the idea and make it feel a bit more achievable.
Absolutely. I mean, my parents are probably legitimate retirement age, but they don't even want to be called retirees. They're just deciding they're running their businesses. I mean, I don't know what business it is, but they just don't want to be sort of identified by that moniker as a retiree,
Yeah.
even though that might be appropriate for them at this stage.
And that's not unusual, right? Because like
Mm,
I can't imagine stopping, like doing nothing, but then a lot of people do enjoy it. It's that point of them having a choice, right? If they get a
mm.
choice about how they want to spend their time, then you've really got where you want to go. And if your money helps you get there, then gee, that's wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. So I thought we'd dive in a little bit further on how could someone thinking about the concept of financial independence and potentially retire early, how could they work out if that goal might be something that suits them and works in with their life?
It's a really important point about the deciding whether it works for you, because there is no right or
Mm,
wrong here, right? So there will be people who just go, look, that's not for me, and that's fine. My theory with this is you've got to decide whether you're the sort of person who's motivated by long-term goals or happy to just plod along without a
mm,
a long-term goal to work towards. So there's a lot of people I imagine who are listening to this podcast who are like, no, I want a goal. I know how much my money needs to be. I know what my retirement fund size needs to be, and I talk about retirement fund in the outside of superannuation sense there. There'll be
mm,
people who are like that, who go, yep, I've got a goal, this is what I'm shooting for, and they have a very clear plan. And if you're like that, then all the stuff around the financial independence movement is helpful for you, because it's a very long-term focused movement. And
yeah.
having that long-term goal, especially, it might seem hard when you're in your 20s to think about decades ahead, but that time's
Mm,
going to pass anyway, right? So having a goal is quite a useful thing, because you're actually working towards something. But if you are
yeah.
not the sort of person who likes a long-term goal, who doesn't need that goalpost in the future, this can still work for you. Just so you know, you can be a bit like me, where you're still just plodding along, and then suddenly one day you go, oh, look, I'm in a better financial situation than I thought I was. There's nothing that I think the FIRE movement or the financial independence stuff that you do does that robs you of anything. I mean, some people will have
Mm,
this feeling of, oh, well, you have to live like a monk. um, that's not really true. It's up to you to design it how you want it to be. Living like a monk just gets you there faster, is the theory. That's for people who really want to get there when they're young. That's the people who have that goal that they want to get there within a decade or so. But even if you just do small things now, save a little bit more now, get into investing earlier and small amounts of investing without taking on huge amounts of debt, that kind of stuff, then one day in 10, 20 years' time, you'll wake up and you'll be in a better financial situation than you could have thought if you had done nothing at this point. So I think it's very low risk for people to do some of the actions associated with becoming financially independent. You're only ever going to really put yourself in a better financial situation by having a buffer fund, by having some investments, by having some source of income beyond your job, right? So I think it's pretty low
mm.
risk.
Yeah, that's what I think as well. When people say, "Oh, there's no way you can achieve your goal by X, Y, Z," and it's kind of like, well, even if you don't get there, you're in such a better financial position than you were before. You know a lot more.
Mm.
You've sort of designed your life a lot better. So I think even just taking some elements out of it, even though if you don't want to say your goal is financial independence, just thinking about some of the elements of the movement and the idea of financial independence can put you in a lot better stead.
Exactly, and it's not really that new as a concept. If you read books
No.
like, the Richest Man in Babylon, these
Mm,
concepts of becoming financially independent, of having assets that pay you an income, have been around since money was invented, like 3,000 plus BC.
mm.
We get this tendency, because it's got a bit of popularity at the moment, and there's some people who are new and exciting, to think that this is a brand new concept. It's really not. It's been around for
Mm.
ages. It's just that we don't learn about it, which is the frustrating part, because we really
Yeah.
should be learning about it. Because the sooner you start, and I think that's the thing I've had when I look at my friends who are now in their mid to late 30s and they've got families and they didn't do this stuff, it's a harder slog for them to get there. They've got less time, less of a runway, you might say, if you like that kind of idea of a longer runway gives you a smoother takeoff. That's quite a nice
Yeah.
analogy. So it's harder to catch up. Whereas if you learn this stuff when you're in high school or at university or in your early 20s, gee, you're much further ahead of the game.
And I think that's often what I see on FIRE blogs and forums. They say that their biggest regret is they didn't start investing and learning about money in their 20s,
Mm.
because they're now playing catch up, and it's still achievable. I've seen definitely stories of people that have achieved financial independence after starting in their 30s and 40s and 50s, but it's just going to look quite different for you.
Yeah, and it's that speed thing, right? When you start when you're young and it's a little bit, you don't have to pay as much attention, because the power of time is on your side. The compounding effect
Yeah.
goes for longer. I think it's going to be very interesting in this next decade when we look at the fallout from the coronavirus and what's happening with our economy, which kind of makes me think that even if you haven't started yet and you're in your 30s, then hey, maybe you're not in a bad position if you get onto it in the next couple of years. You might not have lost too much runway there. You never know. No one's got a crystal ball, but yeah, it is one of those things. I think if you're young and listening to this, just little actions sooner make a huge impact, and you can't underestimate that.
Absolutely. And do you think there's any examples or situations where someone might want to become financially independent, and even though they try their best, it's just not possible?
Oh, definitely. There's plenty of situations like that. So I think about my mum when she was a single parent and looking after two kids. And, we were 8 and 6 when my parents split up. And although my dad did contribute financially, it was very erratic because he ran his own business. And also because he ran his own business, of course, anyone who's run their own business knows that if people don't do their deductions very well, that can represent a lower income than perhaps is real. So having done my books for my dad for a couple of years, I know he was probably paying less childcare than he really had to. And since he's now absolved all his debts with the tax office, I can talk about that. But I think a situation like that for my mum, she was keen to start investing, wanted to do it, knew the theory, but there was literally no money spare. There was nothing. She was a magician with money. She stretched every dollar like to 5. It was incredible what she could achieve with a small income. And, my sister and I never felt like we went without. I know we didn't have flashy holidays. We had, the 1-week trip to the Gold Coast from Brisbane, and stay in a motel each year, as opposed to, a fancy overseas trip. But I don't remember ever feeling like I was lacking. But the impact is she had no extra money to save and then invest. She had some savings as a buffer, but couldn't afford to start buying shares or property or anything like that. And that was a good 10 years. From when I was 8 to about 18, when she just didn't have spare cash. But then, while she had been working through that period, she was getting promotions, getting paid a bit more. I started looking after myself. My sister started looking after herself, and we both moved out of home. Suddenly, Fran had more money. And at that point, she'd had such good discipline about saving that she had capital that she could very quickly deploy. And she'd been learning about it as she went. So I think for people that might be in similar situations, maybe they're struggling to get work. Maybe they have high outgoings relating to their family. They've got care responsibilities. Those are people who are going to look at financial independence and just go, it's just not for me. And you might be right right now, and you might be right for the next decade or two. Who knows? We don't know what's going to happen. But if you learn about it now and you start putting in the disciplines about saving now, then when you do have some spare cash, then you can jump onto it quicker. Then you don't have that moment of, oh no, I've got some money. What shares should I buy? How do I buy shares? If you've thought about that already, you're ready to go. So I think there are people in that situation where, you won't feel like it's achievable for you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn about it and be prepared for when the opportunity comes around. And then, of course, there's people who have retired. I speak to a lot of people who have retired who are keen to improve their financial situation. You can probably improve it and tweak it, but your chances of getting to financial independence once you stopped earning your own income is much harder. It'd be very hard to do it on an Australian pension considering it's so low. It's basically our poverty line.
Yeah, and it's just sort of enough to get by. It's not really enough to put any extra aside.
Exactly. Total subsistence living. We are, I think it was number 31 or 33 out of 35 OECD countries for how much we put into pension. It's embarrassing for a country like us to have put so little into our pension. And that doesn't look like changing significantly in the short term.
And I think it was only this year I sort of realised how low the sort of Centrelink payments were before coronavirus. I hadn't really put much thought into that before, and then just some of the articles coming out about saying, well, let's not put it back to where it was before. I was just amazed, like bad. I don't know. I was shocked about how do people even survive off that?
Well, and the irony of this, right? So that super low level of subsistence living where you are scraping by, and every day you are worried about, can I afford my rent and my food? Actually, like creates financial stress, which affects your IQ, which means you make worse decisions. So the irony is we keep people in this state of stress and worry and concern, and it makes their lives worse because they make worse decisions. We actually end up with this manufactured situation. And that's where there's a lot of tension, I think, with our government, this perception of, you need to work or contribute to earn your money. Well, look, if you take away that financial stress and put that floor under people, so they feel like they're not going to lose their home, they're going to be able to afford to eat, you've got a better chance of them actually succeeding in life and finding employment that they can then support themselves with. But we make it like, oh, you've got to go first. You've got to find the job first and get the income first, and then you'll be okay. Yeah, it's an interesting time, but I think, that raise the rate that people are talking about, raising that basic rate, makes a lot of sense to me, because even looking at the pension, I don't know how people survive on the pension. They're magicians, these people, extraordinary.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So it's definitely going to be interesting to sort of see what comes out of this this year and whether that is changed for good.
Absolutely, and let's hope it does. I would really appreciate that if it did.
Yeah. Now, I wanted to ask, what are some examples of maybe some hard choices you had to make on your journey to financial independence, even though you weren't possibly maybe aware you were on that journey? You did say that you saved 50 cents in the dollar. So that's probably meaning you did have to make some sacrifices in your 20s.
Yeah, I guess it probably sounds like that, doesn't it? The funny thing is, I don't feel like I missed anything important. And I don't know if this is because I spent a lot of time hanging out with people at high school. I went to a state primary school, which was very average, and then I got a scholarship to an elite private school for high school, and because we couldn't have afforded to go there either. But if I hadn't got that, I would have been going to the local state school. But I was suddenly thrown in with a bunch of people who had a lot more money. Now, most people would look at a private school and go like, oh, well, everyone's got money. Well, my experience is that's not the truth. Probably, 20% of them have got heaps of money, but the other 80% are families that are making big sacrifices to get their children there. I had one friend whose both parents were working 2 jobs each just to be able to afford to put the kids through school. So we get this impression that it's lots of people have money, and that might be true. Maybe it's changed over the intervening 20 odd years, but my experience was that no, you still have plenty of people who worked hard. But these 10 or 20% that had ridiculous quantities of money, who were talking about getting nose jobs in year 11, seriously, we had a girl who got a nose job. Like, I was like, how can you be spending money on how you look at this age? Things like that.
I wasn't even thinking about my nose in year 11.
It was a new world for me. It was something I hadn't seen before. And people who were getting given cars, like brand new, expensive cars, like my first car was an $1,800 Mitsubishi Gagner. I saw it and I just didn't emulate their behavior or their appreciation of money at all. What I saw was a lot of being spoiled. That's what I saw. I saw a lot of, and it was young women for me, whose attitudes, frankly, were really immature when it came to money. I didn't see their parents doing them any favors. I thought, that is, you are really making your life harder. And I meet a lot of them now. Some of them have gone on to do really well financially. They've had great careers. Some of them have not. That was that they have built up a behavior of expectation of handouts, and it continues into our late 30s. And I look at that and think, that is what a waste. What a waste. Not just of the money, of your life. So I guess when I saw a lot of people getting given lots of stuff and wearing fancy clothes, they weren't any happier than I was. They didn't have a better home life than I did. They didn't have a better relationship with their parents. They didn't have nicer people to hang around. There was nothing that I saw apart from they were more comfortable. They had a nicer flashy car or a nicer house. And, I was like, that's really cool. And I get it. But I was like, that's not how I'm going to be spending my money. So I think I made a decision quite early on that I was going to focus my spending on things that really made me happy and nothing that didn't make me happy. And I suspect a lot of people buy things because they feel compelled to buy things, or they feel like they're supposed to, that keeping up with the Joneses thing. That's the impression I get. A lot of people who will look around the neighborhood and go, oh my gosh, my car's the daggiest car. This is a bit embarrassing. I better buy a nicer car. Whereas I'm like, I have the daggiest car and that's why I don't have to go to work, everybody. You're like, I think the payoff with my time has been worth it. And I've just had that in my mind since I was, in my teens. So it was never a problem for me. And also I have to say, engineering is definitely an anti-fashion career, and engineers are definitely pro reducing waste, right? So I was surrounded by people who did not care how I looked How I looked did not determine what kind of job I got. It was all about my intelligence and my capabilities and my
Yeah.
ability to deliver a product for them. And people didn't really, I had to wear hard yakka to work, like I wore bright orange and dark blue for the, first 10 years of my career, and no one looks good in that stuff. So, and that was pretty deliberate choosing that career too, getting to have that kind of environment. But it's never felt like I had any pressure to look a certain way, to own a certain set of things. And I see, whenever I see that money spent, like if I see a flash car, I still go, that is a deposit on a house. What a waste. It's just how I think. So yeah, I guess that's a very long rambling answer for, I don't feel like I missed out. I still had expensive holidays. I still like good food. I live in a fantastic suburb. I can see the ocean from my house. Everybody's happy, but I just don't have, I've got hand-me-down furniture and curbside collection furniture because I just don't care. Those things don't matter to me. So it's actually been a real advantage.
Yeah. So it sounds like you worked out your priorities pretty early on.
Yeah, and I do really know what makes me happy now. I think that's something that maybe a lot of people, when they're busy, you're working and you're grinding away, you might not think about what actually makes you happy. Might not spend $1 and go, did I get anything out of that? There's some basic stuff you have to spend. You have to spend money on power and food, and when I say power, I mean like electricity. Then that probably sounded a bit weird. But you know what I mean, the basics that you have to have. But then there's that extra luxury stuff that every time I've spent $1, think about the purchases you've made that you've looked at later and gone, why did I buy that? And it only took a few of those for me to go, I'm not buying that stuff again. It's just not worth it. I don't get enough happiness out of it. And I traded my time to be able to buy it. And what a silly trade that was.
And I think people that have reached financial independence often do say that, like, the amount of days they've been able to buy back and the time and the control and the freedom is worth 1,000 cars, really.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and then there'll be people, right, who love cars. My husband loves cars, right? That's cool. He loves cars. He loves fast motorbikes. He has one fast motorbike. That's what he has. He doesn't buy a new one each year. He doesn't get upgraded. But if it's your thing, make it your thing, but don't have all the things. Pick the few things that you get the most benefit out of. And I think if you can get that kind of focus and prioritization, it becomes a lot easier. And then you don't feel like you're giving up so much. But again, there are people who do this without giving up a lot. They just do it a lot slower. So it's just about what suits you.
And not having too many expensive hobbies.
Yeah, well, you wouldn't want to be into sailing or something like that.
Or skiing.
Yeah, exactly. So there are things like that. But again, like, if that's your thing, then make that your thing. Make your life about being able to afford that thing. If that's what makes you happy, go for it. But don't do skiing and fast motorbikes. Pick one.
Yeah.
Something like that I think can help people. It's just this idea of I think the mindless consumerism stuff, I think that really sets us back, this buying lots of clothes or buying fancy things for the insides of our house. I feel like that stuff maybe is probably the more wasteful spending and worth definitely paying attention to if you're prone to it.
Absolutely. Now, one of the common reasons that people throw up when I and others talk about the idea of financial independence, for the reason they cannot possibly achieve it, is starting a family. I mean, even when I was talking to people a few years ago at the very beginning about learning about financial independence, they're like, oh, but what if you start a family? Then your goal's not possible. And I mean, I'm not even thinking about that at the moment, but that seemed to be the reason everyone chucked at you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, of course. And look, I can understand that, because there is a perception that children are super expensive. And that is justified when you look at childcare fees, I have to say, like $100 to $150 a day for childcare. So
that's crazy.
Yeah, I know. And that's before your rebates, of course, but still really expensive in Australia. So that's why that debate at the moment about childcare being free and suddenly we're having to pay for it again, pretty serious debate, making a big impact on earnings. But yes, you're right. There's this perception that your costs are going to go up. Now, I've got 2 children, 7 and 5. And I'm in the situation where I became financially independent before my first child arrived. So that was very lucky. But what people would probably be thinking is, how much do your costs go up when you have kids? And this is a how long is a piece of string question, right? Definitely. So it's about, what kind of schooling you want to give them. A private school is 25 plus grand a year. It's like buying a car and driving it off a cliff, like it's, I'm quoting Waleed Ali there, by the way. I didn't come up with that.
Okay.
But it's serious money, like if I wanted to put both my kids through private school, that'd be 50 grand that I'd have to earn. And that's after tax, right? So, So I think people see things like that. They see the cost of having the child at home and food, and they worry about it. So my experience now that I've got a child at 7 and 5 is that your living costs do go up incrementally. So we probably spend on average $10,000 to $15,000 more a year than we would if we didn't have children. And I know this because I know how much we spent previously and how much we spend now, and our living hasn't changed a lot. And that's a factor of providing a bigger house, extra consumption. You're using a bit more electricity, a bit more water. That stuff's not huge, because once you pay for it for one or two people, the extra couple don't make too much of a difference. Food will obviously, that expense grows over time. What my observation is it's the expenses of holidays. Suddenly you're not paying for 2 airplane tickets, you're paying for 4, and you've got to go during peak periods. You got to go during school holidays. It's the extracurricular stuff that your kids go into, and it's how much you spend on their education and how much you're willing to give them. Some parents feel compelled to pay for the university education, whereas others go, no, please use HEX. So those are all very personal decisions, and there is no right or wrong answer. And I think that's where people think, well, I have to send my kids to a private school, so suddenly I'm going to need an extra 50 grand a year if I've got 2 children, which means I've got to earn 75 a year. That's significant. Like, that's more than we spent in my family. So that's where people get that freak out. So I think you've got to be very careful about what your priorities are with your kids. And of course, when they're little, you don't know. Like, I still haven't decided whether we'll send our kids to private school or not. And I certainly don't have enough assets to cover the passive income for that extra cost at the moment. If I wanted to send my children to a private school for high school, we would need to go and earn that money. But we would be able to. I feel like both my husband and I would just be able to go back to work. I've got my businesses. I still do some consulting. He's also an engineer. So it really is a question of priorities for us. It's not a question of finances. I think some people see, oh, well, I've got financial independence, I'm never going to earn money from an income again. That's not really true. Like, lots of people are going to have little jobs that they do, or some consulting that they do, or you can pick up a job for a few years if you want to cover that cost. So I don't think it's a reason to say, no, I can't get to financial independence, but you might want to factor in that slightly increased cost. And then I think as well, if let's say you don't get to financial independence, but part of your living costs are covered by your financial independence fund. So you've got some dividends, some rent, some yield, whatever you've got coming in, coupons from your bonds, interest from the bank, if that ever happens into a reasonable magnitude again. You never know, it might happen. Even if it doesn't cover all of your costs, then maybe you only have to work part-time or a part of the year. So what's the downside again? What's the problem with doing that? It's going to put you in a better position, I would think, and you can make that decision when you're ready. I'm not one of those parents that's made a lot of commitments that are extracurricular. So my children, because they're young and because I'm quite lazy, don't do lots of sports. They don't do dancing, things like that. They can if they want to, but we have a rule in our household that you have to ask twice. And neither of my children, I should say none, like I've got thousands, neither of my children have asked me more than once for anything. I think one child asked me to go dancing, another one asked for soccer, and I was like, sure, okay, if you want to, and they've never asked again. So I'll wait until they really care.
I remember when I was I think maybe 10 years old, I really wanted to do singing lessons, and my parents said, well, you've got to prove your dedication to wanting to do this. So they made me, they said, if you want to do it, you have to sing at the local Eisteddfod.
Oh, wow.
And so I had to go off and register, and I performed in front of maybe 100 people.
Wow.
Just some song. And then that was proof that I was dedicated enough to have singing lessons.
Holy amazing, man. That is some serious dedication to do when you're a kid. I am so impressed. But yeah, exactly. I think, then I've got my children have got classmates that are in 3 or 4 things. They've got something on the weekend, they've got a language lesson, they've got a music lesson. So your costs can rack up. So it's really a question about what is important to you as a family and what your values are, and being honest about it. But my baseline is sort of 10 to 15 grand extra a year, and that's for both kids. It was 10 when I had just one, and 5 grand a year extra now with the second child. So it's not prohibitive, in my opinion. That's not significant enough to say you can't get to financial independence. But if I was going to enroll them in every extracurricular activity, have every fancy holiday, and then send them to a private school, then you probably have to work to cover those costs, unless you're going to sell an asset or you're very lucky with your investing.
So it might slow down your journey by a few years if you're sort of taking a more reasonable approach to it, but it's definitely sounds like it's still possible with a family.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess the experience I've had now, so because my husband and I don't have to work. So he's in his second mini retirement since we've had kids. I haven't had a mini, and I'll just also clarify, having a mini retirement when you're at home with a small baby, that's not a mini retirement. That is work, just so you know. I don't count that as a mini retirement. But once they become a bit more independent, so sort of that 3+, it can be a really nice time. My husband's had 2 breaks at home. So he had the whole year of 2017 off at home. And then he's now into month 15 of his second mini retirement because our son is at kindy. So he's still doing the 2 days, 1 week, 3 days the next. So he's got a lot of a home time. And so Adam has absolutely adored being able to be home with the children. He loves it, really enjoys it. And having had that flexibility where he can take that time off if he wants to has been wonderful. And it means that we haven't had as well to do the childcare costs. That's helped. Being able to have even just the one partner who can do all the pickups, and we both get to go to all the concerts and all the fun stuff. So you don't feel like you're missing out on as much, like you feel like you get a bit more value out of it. So I think, even if you get to the point where it means one parent can take time off or you can both work part-time, then surely that's going to relieve the load a little bit so you can enjoy this period when they're young and they still like you, which is my focus right now.
Before they enter the teens.
Yeah, and they're like, go away, Mum, we don't want to know you. Yeah, so I know that's coming, so I'm savouring what I've got.
And I think that sort of gets back to the concept of having that time and that freedom. And I think kids probably appreciate, I mean, I did when I was a kid. I really appreciated having the time with my parents and not having to go to before school care and after school care every day like I saw some of my friends do. And I got to read with my parents and all that sort of stuff. And that was much more important to me than any device. Although at the time I might have really desperately wanted the latest Tamagotchi. Looking back as someone in their 20s, I really appreciate having that time and I don't really remember all the stuff.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? I feel similar about my childhood, that I don't remember missing, that I didn't have things, like it's not the things, it is the time. And I think I do it for selfish reasons. Like I hope that my children remember it and appreciate it. But if they don't, I'm doing it because I like it. I like them, and it's pretty fun to watch them grow up. And I would feel like I was missing out. Now there are plenty of people who are not cut from that same cloth. They love parts of it, but not all of it, and they'd rather someone else did some of the really mundane stuff. Because I have to tell you, wiping bums and changing nappies and all those things get really, really monotonous. So it's perfectly fine if you don't want to stay at home. Being financially independent doesn't mean you have to do all that extra stuff, but it does mean that you can have the freedom to choose which stuff you do, which I think is probably a bit more of an incentive. For people who are like, oh, look, I don't really want to stay at home. Well, fine, don't stay at home, but do all the fun things, have the extra holidays with them, that kind of stuff, the things that you enjoy. And as they get older, I'm really appreciating that.
Absolutely. And I think that threads back to the common theme throughout your book of becoming time rich. And that was when I read it at Money School a few months ago. I think that was the thing that really stood out to me the most. Instead of just focusing on that financial independence, retire early, focusing on becoming time rich. And I think that's such a great motivator. And I wanted to hear your thoughts. Do you think that's starting to become a better motivator for people than just the thought of quitting your job?
I think it does. You think about your parents who like, I don't want to retire, and most of us don't want to do nothing, we want to do something, but we want a bit more discretion. And I think that the retiring early has been code for that. People sort of hear for retiring early and think, oh, do you mean I'm going to go sit on a beach and drink pina coladas for the next 50 years? they most people have realized, but we've ended up with like this incredible plethora of acronyms. It's a fascinating Google search, the alternatives to FIRE. There's work optional and there's a flamingo number and there's all sorts of, lean FIRE and fat FIRE and it's fascinating.
I saw Coast Fire the other day.
Oh, right,
that was quite interesting.
Yeah, so everyone's got a different take on this, and I reckon the reason so many of them have come through like this is because retiring early just doesn't hit the mark. It does not say what it means. It's a beautiful acronym. We love FIRE, beautiful, but it doesn't do it. So I think I was searching for the reason I chose time rich, like financially independent time rich, was to achieve something that was, look, this is what you actually get to, and then you choose. It's the systemic person in me. I want an umbrella term that all the other ones fit under, and I thought time rich worked. I hope that it helps people who thought, oh, retiring early is not for me, still consider financial independence. That's what I'm trying to achieve with all that sort of renaming is. People don't just hear the retire early bit and write it off. They go, oh, time rich, I could do that. And actually start learning about it and get interested in their money. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a a better way to sort of frame it, especially when you're setting goals, because if your goal on your board is just retire early, it's probably not as inspiring as actually having that time back and actually thinking about all the things you could do with that time.
Yeah, exactly. And finding that alternative. I feel like we get, or a lot of people get stuck to a grindstone sort of feeling. And of course, when you have children, it actually gets worse because you've got so much else to keep you busy. You kind of like, I'll just keep going on autopilot with work. And it would be really
Yeah.
disappointing to wake up in a couple of decades' time and be like, I really wish I'd designed that better. Because you can
Mm.
design it better. And I guess that's the other thing, is our mainstream narrative is work till you're in your mid to late 60s and then retire. And it's just not feasible so much for people as well. I also get quite concerned about young people's ability to earn a sustainable income that allows them to do that. We've got a very
Mm.
old system that relied on people being able to find steady, stable jobs. And it's just not how it's likely to be. The gig economy is not serving
Mm.
that purpose. And so I feel like there's a risk there that as well you're going to find yourself stuck working into your 70s and 80s because you can't afford to retire even with the pension, which is a big
Mm.
risk.
Yeah. And who knows what the pension's going to be like in 50 years?
Oh man, if we even have one. Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? Well, having seen the trend over the last however many years we've had it, like it's been decades, right?
Mm.
It hasn't improved markedly. Relative to our incomes, it is still low. It's still our poverty line, and I think
Mm.
that's not a good thing to aim for. We want to aim for something a little bit more comfortable, I would think, most people.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the last questions I want to ask you, because it's sort of venturing a little bit off the topic of financial independence, but something I notice that you do a lot in your newsletter and your book and even your upcoming money debates is you encourage people to think about financial topics a little bit more critically and actually look at both sides of the issue.
Mm.
And I thought you might have some ideas on how to approach our finances and the information we consume a little bit more critically.
Yeah, look, that's such an important point, that critical thinking. And
Mm.
there is a human inclination, I think, that we want a recipe. We want it done for us. Just tell me,
Yeah.
what percentage do I need to save and where do I need to put it? And that's why it's really attractive when someone says to you, here's the recipe, follow my steps exactly, and you'll be fine. And it is possible to get the kind of recipe that is a minimum effective dose for everybody. You can get those kinds of recipes, but it's very rare that it's going to be the best recipe for everybody. It's
Mm.
maybe going to get you all on average to do okay. And there will be people that it's perfect for, but then there's going to be a whole heap of people that, hey, you could have done a lot better if you just thought about it. And there's stuff to do with money, I think, that people get really wrapped up about. There's a right or wrong answer. There are only a few absolute right or wrongs with money, like
Mm.
very few, like two or three at most. Most of it is actually about your personality, your risk profile, and what your priorities are. And no one can tell you that. Only
Mm.
you know that, right? And so this is the argument for you needing to think about this stuff, because otherwise you pick up a recipe and you go, well, I'll just follow this. It's like when you think about people's what they eat, your diet. And I don't mean that in the sense of losing weight diet. I mean what you eat. Some people
Mm.
react badly to gluten. Some people react badly to dairy. Some people don't like meat. There is no blanket rule, and you have to look at what works for you and adjust it accordingly. And if you just pick up every book or read every article or listen to a podcast like this and go, well, I'm going to do exactly what they say without having to think about how it fits for you, then
Mm.
that's quite risky, because they might have made an assumption that is incorrect for you. And this is, I guess, my engineering background coming through. Most of what
Mm.
goes wrong is because people make terrible assumptions. They poorly
Mm.
scope what they're doing. They don't. They think, oh well, it must be this when it's not that thing at all. And superannuation is a classic one for this. Everyone says, well, everyone. I'm going to use that very blanket term. You will hear a lot of financial advisors say put discretionary income, if you've got it, you've got extra money, into superannuation as voluntary contributions. Whereas someone in
Mm.
the financial independence community would go, you're insane. You're tying that money up for decades. Don't do that.
Mm.
Invest it over here. So both of them are right. Both of those things can work. So which one is right if they're completely polar opposites? That depends on you.
Mm.
That depends on your goals. So whenever you read something, you will be able to find the alternative opinion somewhere. It is definitely worth looking for people who are independent, qualified preferably. And when I say independent, they're not trying to sell you a financial product. They're not saying, hey, get into property investing and, hey, look at this, I've got this fantastic property investment opportunity for you over here. But thinking critically about your source and then looking for the alternatives and really bringing it down to what works for you, I think is important, if not essential,
Mm.
really. Um, because if you don't go with what's aligned with your values and your beliefs, that's when you make mistakes. The people who hate debt that go into investing in property because they were told they had to do it, and then they stuff it all up because they're so scared. Even though it could have been the best investment in the world, they still freak out. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Do the thing that's right for you, but that means you actually have to think about what's right for you. So it takes more time up front, but you're going to get a better result.
And just knowing the way you're going to react to things, and that's something you can't always test until you dive in the deep end. But I think that it comes back to really thinking and exploring different opinions and seeing how different ideas fit with you.
Exactly. I totally agree.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to know where can people go to learn more about you, your journey, your book, Money School, and get their hands on a copy?
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. The best place to go is moneyschool.org.au. And there's lots of free blogs on there. We've got a financial independence calculator you can play with, and you can find the links to buy the book as well. And I'll share that for the show notes. And of course, we run events occasionally. So please join the email list. And we've got an exciting one coming up, which is this money debates idea where we're going to pull apart some of these sacred cows. But yeah, jump onto the website and come say hi and send me your questions.
Yeah, I'm really, really excited for the debates. I think 2 weeks' time?
Yes, I think we kick off the 24th of August with all the educational content, and then the 31st of August we'll be having the debates each evening, and it's going to be a lot of fun.
And I think that's something we probably don't do enough of in real life, actually sort of toss ideas back and forward and look at both sides of them, because most people are just going to be fierce advocates for one or the other because maybe that's what their job is telling them to do, or their background, or what they studied. So I'm really excited to actually listen to some of them. I think some of the topics like about whether money should be taught in, like financial education should be taught in schools, and whether banks should be allowed in.
Yeah,
so that's going to be an interesting one.
It's good. We made the criteria when we approach the speakers. Do not pick a topic that you are sitting on the fence about. We don't want to hear you're on the fence. We want to pick the side that you are most closest to. That's going to be fun. So there are a few of them that are a bit uncomfortable, like, I don't really want to say that that's absolutely wrong. I'm like, it's okay. It's going to be a debate. People know what a debate means. We are forcing you to take a side, but we will explore in some depth things that you might not traditionally hear. Because I know when I write a blog, I try to be quite balanced, present both sides of the stories, and I think a lot of people do that. It'll be fun to have some people going on the absolute extreme ends. And I think that allows you to really test an idea. And I hope our audience will be listening and thinking, what works for me as we go through it.
Yeah, and it might give people a lot more ideas. So I'm certainly linked to that in the show notes as well, so people can check that out. And it's only $11, so there's absolutely no harm in signing up. It's the cheapest conference I've ever seen in my life.
Well, we did it as an experiment. We thought we'd keep it cheap so that people can come and see if they like it. And we've just had such an overwhelming response. 40 odd speakers now we're up to. It's incredible. It's delightful to see such excitement in the community about it as well. I really hope this will help people explore these ideas and decide what works for them.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the Australian Finance Podcast today, Lacey.
Thanks for having me, Kate. It's been delightful.